Well, thank you all for being here this evening. What a critically important moment in history, with the remarks that we heard yesterday from JD Vance so perfectly framing our time here together. It was almost 80 years ago to the day that Winston Churchill gave a famous speech, one of the most important of the 20th centuries, and he talked about an iron curtain descending across this continent. And I wonder perhaps whether Vice President Vance's speech yesterday will be viewed with the same significance as Churchill's 80 years ago. Because Vance was essentially warning of a new iron curtain descending across the West, dividing free speech from censorship. And at the moment, we have to admit that we here in this room, we here in Europe, we're on the wrong side of that. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, he was at the World Economic Forum, and he stated that we need more social media regulation. He said, to quote, "for the sake of our social cohesion, our mental health, and our democracies." He was quickly followed by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who took it even further. Scholz said, quote, "we have freedom of speech in Europe and Germany, but we don't accept it if it's supporting extreme right positions." Extreme right being something, of course, that is defined by Scholz and his friends. And then here in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said recently that Britain needs to think about changing its terrorism laws, the strongest laws we have in this country, to target, quote, "young men in their bedrooms who spend their time isolated and online." This is the European model, one where our governments dictate acceptable speech and criminalize dissent. And the cost of this censorship is devastating. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit about it on our panel. I just want to mention 3 of the cases that we're working on right now. Of course, one of them took up about 10% of Vice President Vance's speaking time in Munich, the case of Adam Smith-Connor, a British Army veteran who was criminally prosecuted and convicted for silent prayer. And in the news that I saw following Vance's speech yesterday, there were all sorts of articles saying, that's not what happened. The articles say he wasn't convicted for silent prayer. He was convicted for breaking a public space protection order, which is like saying that someone was not convicted of stabbing someone. They were convicted of breaching the Homicide Act 1957. It's ridiculous. In Finland, long-standing member of the Finnish parliament, Päivi Räsänen, faces criminal prosecution. Yesterday, Valentine's Day, 5 years ago, I met Päivi for the first time in Helsinki as we decided to support her case. 5 years later, she's been indicted, prosecuted, she's been tried once, acquitted, tried a second time, acquitted, and now goes to the Supreme Court of Finland for posting some Bible verses on X. And in Australia, fearless activist and father known by the name Billboard Chris, he goes to court next month, not for actions taken on Australian soil, but for posting a comment on X, criticizing the appointment of a transgender activist to an important WHO policy writing role. Billboard Chris is Canadian. He posted his comments on an American platform, and now he is facing trial for that in Australia. And his case underscores how censorship regimes are no longer confined by geography, and that authorities in Western countries are now extending their reach beyond their borders, creating a world where speech is increasingly regulated at a global scale. The EU's Digital Services Act and its web of complex regulations will undoubtedly have effects far beyond the EU, as social media platforms are forced to comply with EU rules or face massive crippling penalties. And they will increasingly, therefore, apply restrictions worldwide, setting a de facto global standard for speech regulation. And this means that even those who live in free speech jurisdictions may find themselves silenced as platforms opt for the lowest common denominator of compliance, rather than risk significant financial or legal repercussions. It is impossible for the West to sustain a future where one part is censored and the other remains free. To echo Churchill from 80 years ago, there can be no digital iron curtain. So let me conclude before we get into the discussion. We are undoubtedly living in unprecedented eras of tension within the West right now over this most fundamental human right, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. And those who value freedom must recognize the stakes. And these stakes are most dire for the average person, someone like Adam Smith Connor, who just wants the freedom to peacefully express his views without fear of government punishment. The great free speech divide has become clear. Now is the time for the great free speech comeback.